Reformed thinking. Welcome back to the deep dive. You brought a really fascinating stack of material today. We're zeroing in on what has to be one of the most essential scriptural analyses there is.
It really is.
We're talking about human corruption and, maybe more to the point, the singular way of salvation. So we're diving deep into Paul's epistle to the Romans, specifically chapters 3 and 4.
And we're using the lens of Jonathan Edwards to help us, to really get at the clarity of what Paul is arguing about universal guilt and why personal justification by faith alone is just non-negotiable.
Right.
So for you, the listener, our mission here is pretty clear. We want to go past the surface reading of these verses. I mean, they're famous, but we're going to dissect what the Apostle Paul was really trying to show about the what gets called the native state of mankind.
The native state.
The condition in which every single person comes into the world.
Yeah.
If we can grasp the absolute universality and the depth of human wickedness, we can see why the whole doctrine of salvation has to rest entirely on Christ's provision.
It all hinges on it.
It does. If Paul's initial proof of guilt is anything less than absolute, then the gospel itself kind of gets diminished, right? It becomes optional instead of necessary.
And that necessity, that's what he sets up right away in Romans 1, is verses 16 and 17. It's the cornerstone of the whole argument. The goal Paul is working toward is proving that nobody can be saved in any other way than through God's righteousness by faith in Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
And I mean, how do you prove something is absolutely necessary?
You show that all the alternatives are impossible.
You prove every alternative is absolutely impossible. And Paul does that by showing that all mankind are, in themselves, wicked and just completely without any righteousness of their own to offer God.
It's a brilliant argument, really. It's a two-step process. First, establish that the patient, all of mankind, is mortally ill.
And then
Second, you establish that the only cure is the one that's being provided, Christ's righteousness.
Okay, so let's start where Paul brings his long argument from chapters 1 and 2 to a head. He's made his case against the Gentile world, then against the religious Jew. Now we get to the culmination, the universal verdict, starting around Romans 3, verse 9.
Exactly. And this section, it's often read so quickly, but the rhetorical force behind it it's almost hard to appreciate fully. Edwards pointed out that this passage is an exceeding full, express, and abundant testimony to humanity's wicked character. He even said, and this is pretty strong, that if this particular string of verses doesn't plainly lay out the matter of universal depravity, then truly no words can do it.
Wow.
Paul uses language that is just meant to overwhelm you with evidence.
Okay, let's unpack that overwhelming feeling then. Paul states his main proposition, that all people, Jews and Gentiles alike, are under sin. And then he starts proving it. So how does he structure this proof? Because it's not just one statement, is it? It's a very careful layering of evidence.
It's like a sophisticated legal strategy. He knows he's making a claim that, especially to his Jewish readers, would be very counterintuitive. They believed their heritage gave them a special status.
Though he has to be meticulous.
Meticulous. He confirms this universal wickedness using what Edwards identifies as a strategy with 3 distinct categories of evidence. And they all point to the absolute scope of human corruption. It's a legal indictment, and he's using Scripture as his witness.
Let's get into that first category then. The proof of absolute universality. Guilt without exception.
The strength of Paul's whole argument here rests on the sheer force of his language. Edwards called it an extraordinary repetition and accumulation of terms. And these terms are specifically chosen to express the most perfect and absolute universality.
So he's not just suggesting it, he's forcing the conclusion.
He is. This is critical because it proves the condition applies to every individual of the whole race, with the single exception of the Redeemer himself. The language is designed to just eliminate any possibility of a loophole for any single person.
It's the redundancy that gets you. Why say all or none 5 or 6 times? It almost feels aggressive.
Well, you realize that theological resistance runs deep, and Paul is methodically shutting down every exit ramp. If he had just said, a lot of people are sinners, the self-righteous could only say, well, that's not me.
I'm the exception.
I'm the exception. By piling up these terms, he just removes that possibility entirely. Look at the way he accumulates the universal terms. He says that both Jews and Gentiles are all under sin. It's a global assertion. They are all gone out of the way.
And the legal consequence of that.
The consequence is that all the world, not just some part of it, but the whole thing, may become guilty before God.
And the law itself, he kind of weaponizes it for this purpose. The law's function here is that every mouth may be stopped. It silences any defense.
Exactly. The law is there to stop the debate. It's so comprehensive that Paul says there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. Why? Because all have sinned and fallen short of God's perfect standard, his glory.
That point about no difference is key. If there were a difference in their basic standing before God, the whole argument just falls apart.
It does. The fact that he says no difference shows that the guilt applies equally to the person who has the law and the person who doesn't.
And then, as if that weren't enough, we get this second, even sharper rhetorical tool, the multiplied negatives. He doesn't just say everyone is bad.
He says no one is good.
Yeah.
And that's the secondary absolute layer of proof. It moves from inclusion, all are guilty, to exclusion, no one is righteous. He uses these emphatic negatives. None righteous, no, not one.
That phrase is so powerful. Why do you think he feels the need to use both none and then add no, not one? It seems redundant on the surface.
Because theological arguments are always about finding the nuances, the exceptions, and Paul is refusing to allow any nuance here. If he only said none righteous, someone might argue he meant none in a collective sense. But adding no, not one, individualizes the denial. He is absolutely speaking of individuals. He's denying the existence of a single, solitary person anywhere in the world at any point in history who has enough self-generated righteousness to stand before God.
And this leads then to the final conclusion that the law can't save us. The ultimate condemnation by the law is stated. By the deeds of the law, there shall no FSEH be justified in his sight.
That phrase, no flesh, brings it back to just the raw fact of being human, being in a body. It means no human being in their native, unregenerate state can meet God's standard.
So when Edward says the language is intentionally contrived and heaped up one upon another, he's highlighting this meticulous, airtight legal strategy. It's designed to bring the whole world to silence before God.
Exactly. There are no more arguments left.
Okay, so that establishes the how many. It's universal. Everyone. Now we pivot to the how bad. The nature, the intensity of this guilt. This is where we get into the doctrine of total depravity.
Right. And the scripture here defines this native state as one of total and desperate wickedness. It's not just that people occasionally sin. Edwards points out that they are born exceedingly depraved, having an infallible disposition to be wicked as soon as possible.
That phrase, infallible disposition, is really important for understanding total depravity from a Reformed perspective, isn't it?
It is. It doesn't mean every person is as evil as they could possibly be all the time. You know, we're not all serial killers.
Right.
But it means that sin has corrupted every single part of the human person. The mind, the will, the emotions, leaving no area untouched. And it makes a person incapable of starting any spiritual good on their own without God's intervention.
So let's break down that internal spiritual incapacity first. Paul's design, in Romans 3 you're saying, is to show that everyone is altogether corrupt, depraved in every part. And he proves this by first denying that we have any true spiritual capacity in our natural state.
Yes, we see a complete lack of the necessary spiritual faculties for a right relationship with God. First, there's the absence of spiritual knowledge. Paul says plainly, there is none that understandeth.
And this isn't about IQ or education.
Not at all. You can be a brilliant theologian, know all the original languages, and still not possess this understanding. This is about spiritual enlightenment, the ability to grasp the truth of God and your own sinfulness in a way that actually leads to change. And I mean, if you don't understand your true predicament, you're not going to look for the cure.
Which flows right into the next point, the absence of any right action.
Precisely. If there's no light, there's no movement toward the light.
Right.
So second, there's an absence of piety or true religion. There is none that seeketh after God. This is a denial of any spiritual initiative from our side.
Man isn't a hungry seeker who just needs to be pointed in the right direction.
No, he's fundamentally running away. Or at best, he's just indifferent. And the root cause of this is right there in the text. There is no fear of God before their eyes. That true filial reverence for God is just absent from the natural heart.
That denial of seeking it's pretty startling, especially in a world that often celebrates the spiritual search. Paul is basically saying that all natural searching is directed away from the true God, or we're just seeking a God we've made in our own image.
That's it. And since the mind is corrupted, no understanding, and the heart is corrupted, no seeking, no fear, the actions must necessarily be corrupted too.
Which is the third point.
the absence of moral action. This spiritual incapacity results in actions that are spiritually useless. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. And as a result, they are together become unprofitable. They are unproductive in terms of genuine spiritual righteousness.
So a person might do things that look good on the outside, like donating to charity or being a good neighbor.
Of course. But when those actions are measured against God's perfect law, which demands perfect motivation and perfect love for God, they don't count as good in the redeeming, justifying sense. They're unprofitable.
So total depravity means we lack the ability to start, sustain, or complete any righteous act that could earn us favor with God. The multiplied negatives deny any possibility of that in our native state.
That's the internal picture.
Okay, now this is where Paul gets particularly graphic and honestly unforgettable. Edwards highlights how Paul doesn't just stop with the invisible spiritual capacities. He starts listing body parts. He enumerates the soul's chief instruments or organs of external action to show that man is all over corrupt in every part.
It's the visible physical manifestation of the inner corruption we were just talking about.
It's like a spiritual body scan.
It is. Paul is saying, you think I'm just talking about abstract ideas? Let me show you where the sin actually comes out from your mouth to your feet. This catalog of anatomical corruption is designed to be shocking.
Let's start with the organs of speech, because he spends a lot of time there. The throat, tongue, lips, mouth. He says the corruption here denotes a most extreme and desperate wickedness of heart.
Right. It shows that what comes out of a person is a direct reflection of what's decaying inside.
He starts with the throat, described as an open sepulcher. That's a visceral image. A sepulcher is a tomb. It's where death and decay live.
Think about it. What comes out of a tomb? Foul air, the smell of corruption, of death. Paul is saying that the stream of words, the gossip, the lies, the complaints, the venom that comes from an unregenerate person's throat is spiritually foul. It is the sound of spiritual death.
Wow. It's not just imperfect communication, it's death-spreading communication.
Yes. Then he moves to the tongue and lips. They're characterized by deceit, and there's the poison of asps under the lips.
So venomous.
Venomous, deadly, dangerous speech. An asp, a viper. It doesn't just annoy you, it can kill you. This shows the intent and the effect of sinful speech. Deceit, slander, cursing. They aren't just minor flaws, they are the deadly expressions of the heart's malice. The words spoken are fatal to someone's reputation or their peace, or even their soul.
And finally, the mouth. It's full of cursing and bitterness. This suggests a constant stream of hostility.
So you've got corruption from the throat like a tomb, deceit from the tongue like poison, and active hostility from the mouth full of cursing. This complete corruption of the organs of speech is meant to show an exceeding degree of wickedness. If the heart were even partly good, surely some pure water would come out sometimes.
But Paul says no. It's all hijacked for wicked purposes. And then the depravity moves beyond communication.
To physical action, the hands are implicitly referenced as being unprofitable for doing good. They fail to perform the law requires.
But the feet are described much more actively as instruments of violence, being swift to shed blood.
They don't drag themselves reluctantly toward sin. They run toward it. They are actively used for destruction and harm. This just demonstrates that human energy and initiative are naturally channeled towards sin.
And the overall result for the whole person is stated plainly. Destruction and misery are in their ways. They're not just wicked, they're self-destructive, and they spread that destruction to others.
Absolutely. This whole catalog, it's not mild, it's not partial. The expressions were chosen to show an exceeding degree of corruption, and this complete state of universal, total, and desperate guilt is the hammer that breaks the listener. It proves that salvation cannot come by works, but only through the redemption which is in Jesus Christ, freely by God's grace.
Okay, so Paul has built what seems like an airtight case. Universal guilt, total corruption. But to really appreciate how strong this doctrine is, we need to look at the interpretations that try to soften it. Historically, people have always tried to limit the scope of this guilt.
That's right. And Edwards, he zeroes in on a specific antagonist, a Dr. T, who argued that the wickedness in Romans 3 was limited, that it didn't apply to every single individual.
And this is a crucial point, because if Dr. T is right, then Paul's argument for Christ's exclusive necessity just collapses.
It completely falls apart. Dr. Q is basically trying to say that the universal terms Paul uses are just, hyperbole, that they only refer to the general bad behavior of two large groups, Jews and Gentiles. But if you allow that loophole, the necessity of Christ for every individual just disappears.
So how does Edwards push back on that? Let's start with the Old Testament citations.
Okay, so Paul uses several Old Testament quotes like, "There is none righteous, no, not one." Dr. T's argument was that these quotes only referred to, say, a strong party within ancient Israel, or just them of whom they were true. He claimed they had no reference to any such universality of all people.
So the argument is something like, Paul is just quoting Psalms about historical enemies of Israel. He's not saying the whole world is condemned.
Exactly, and Edwards argues this view renders Paul's citation completely illogical. He actually calls it nonsense.
Why?
Well, first, it contradicts Paul's purpose. We have to remember Paul's logic. His proposition is that all are under sin. He then cites the universal clause, "There is none righteous, no, not one," to confirm that universal proposition.
Okay.
If the citation only means, well, there are some or even many in Israel that aren't righteous, then the logical connection is gone. The proof doesn't match the claim.
That's a sharp point about coherence. If I claim every single student failed this exam, and my proof is a quote saying a few students in the back row failed, my proof doesn't support my claim. Paul's whole argument is undermined.
Right, and that leads to the second point, which is about rhetorical overkill. If Paul's aim were only to prove that a considerable number or a strong party of Jews were wicked, he would be proving something that, as Edwards says, none of the Jews denied.
So he'd be proving the obvious.
He'd be proving the obvious. The Jews knew their history was full of sinners. The Pharisees readily admitted that their ancestors killed the prophets. If Paul's goal was just to prove that some of their ancestors were bad, why use such complex, overwhelming scriptural proofs? It would be, as Edwards calls it, impertinent. The density and the force of the language only makes sense if he's trying to prove something controversial and absolute.
So there was another argument Dr. T made, right, about collective bodies.
Yes, this was another attempt to soften the blow. He proposed that Paul only spoke of Jews and Gentiles in a collective sense, meaning the generality of these two big groups were wicked, but this would still allow for many exceptions. Many righteous individuals within those groups who could, perhaps, be saved by the law.
So the Gentile world is wicked as a whole, but that still allows for individuals like, say, Socrates or Seneca to be potentially excused. The focus shifts from the individual person to the large national group.
Precisely. And Edwards just dismantles this by going back to the sheer relentless force of the language Paul uses. First, the contradiction of language density. Right.
Edwards asks, if the meaning was only the much greater part, why would Paul use such an extraordinary repetition and accumulation of terms, all, no, not one, no flesh, that are designed to express the most perfect and absolute universality?
It's the difference between saying the majority of the city is corrupt and saying every single citizen, without exception, no, not one, is corrupt. The second statement is just vastly stronger. To suggest Paul only meant most of them disagrees extremely with the terms and language he chose.
He could have easily used Greek words for most or many. He didn't. He chose words that mean all and none. And this leads to what Edwards calls the absurdity of the application, which he illustrates with his famous lame feet analogy.
Oh, this is a great one.
It is. He says, imagine a man talking about his 2 feet. One foot represents the Jewish nation, the other represents the Gentile nation. If this man used all of Paul's universal negative terms, saying, all my feet are lame, none of my feet are strong, no, not one, when he only has 2 feet.
You'd think he was lame in his understanding as well as his feet. Exactly. The language of absolute exhaustive universality is just too broad and precise to be used to describe the general character of only 2 large groups. Because he stresses not one, he must be talking about the state of individuals within those groups.
That analogy makes the academic point so clear. Paul isn't just observing trends in national behavior. He's making a statement about the nature of humanity, person by person.
And that leads to the most critical refutation Edwards offers, the one that absolutely shuts down Dr. T's whole argument. It's that these limited views wholly disannulled Paul's argument because they fail to reconcile the subject of guilt with the subject of justification.
Okay, this is the crux of it. We're moving from the problem, guilt, to the solution, justification. And Paul's logic has to hold together.
It has to.
So the structural integrity of his argument requires this clear parallelism. The subject who is condemned for being wicked must be the same subject who is then offered justification through Christ.
Absolutely. If you limit the scope of the condemnation, you have to limit the scope of the remedy Paul is about to introduce. So, if Dr. T were right that guilt only applies to collective bodies, Jews and Gentiles, then the inability to be justified by law must also only apply to collective bodies.
And that doesn't make sense.
It makes no sense. The argument would be that the Jewish and Gentile collective bodies can't be justified by law. Okay. So is Paul then arguing that the Christian church, a different collective body, is justified? No. Paul is trying to show that the law failed to justify because of man's condition, not because of his group membership.
So if the condemnation is corporate, the solution has to be corporate. But the solution Paul offers, faith in Christ, is profoundly personal. He's arguing that the very subject condemned by the law, the individual human soul, is the very subject that needs salvation by another route.
That is the only logical structure that holds up in Romans. The law condemns you, the individual person, because you are without righteousness. Therefore, you, the individual person, need an alien righteousness. Christ's imputed to you through faith. Personal condemnation requires personal justification. The scope has to match.
And there's direct scriptural evidence for this individual salvation right after the indictment.
Yes. The verses that immediately follow the declaration of universal guilt cannot, without the utmost violence, be understood otherwise than of the justification of particular persons. This confirms that the guilt applies to individuals. Paul shifts from this general indictment of the world to the intimate process of faith.
He focuses on the believer.
Exactly. When Paul presents the solution, he talks about justification through faith in Christ, not through membership in a new group. God is described as the justifier of him that believeth in Jesus. The phrase him that believeth is singular. It's specific.
That's the definitive shift.
It is. The whole problem of our total depravity is met by God's free grace, applied directly to the individual who has faith.
And then Paul draws the conclusion for the individual. Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith, without the deeds of the law. The use of a man, a singular noun, removes any possible ambiguity. He's talking about you, the specific person.
Yes, and this is reinforced in Romans 4, verse 5. It says, righteousness is counted to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly.
Him that worketh not. That's the direct opposite of trying to be justified by the law.
It is. Because you can't work the works of the law successfully, you're forced into this category of him that worketh not. You have to rely entirely on someone else's merit, and justification is for the ungodly. If the individual were even partially righteous, Paul would call them the partially righteous, but he says they're the ungodly, which means they start from a position of absolute spiritual debt.
And then he drives this home by citing Old Testament cases of individuals seeking forgiveness. This isn't a new idea. This has always been God's way of saving a particular soul.
He brings up David. Paul cites David, who describes the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputeth righteousness without works. And David spoke of this with special respect to his own particular case. He's talking about his own personal sin and guilt, probably from Psalm 51, and the joy of his own personal forgiveness. It's the perfect evidence for personal justification.
And then he brings it full circle.
Full circle. When Paul concludes, no fellowship be justified in his sight, back in Romans 3, he's referring to Psalm 143, where the psalmist is talking about the justification of a particular man. He says, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified.
So the very source Paul used to prove that no one can be justified by the law is a specific, single, righteous man realizing his own need for forgiveness.
It is. The argument is flawlessly structured. The necessity of faith in Jesus Christ as the only way of salvation applies to every individual, because the condition of universal native wickedness applies to every individual of the whole race. Because every man is condemned by the law, every man needs a different way of righteousness. Paul ensures that our hopelessness is absolute, so that our hope in Christ can be absolute as well.
Okay, let's try to unpack this whole deep dive then. We started with the proposition that salvation is only through Christ's righteousness by faith.
Right.
And we saw this is necessary because Paul proves, using this overwhelming, accumulated, extremely strong language, that every individual person is born into a state of total, desperate wickedness. He denies righteousness in every capacity, both spiritual and physical.
And the defense from Edwards shows us the absolute logical necessity of this. If the condemnation of the law is not universal and personal, then the justification offered by Christ is also not strictly personal, and Paul's entire argument for redemption just loses its coherence. It becomes illogical, the law stops every mouth before God, and the justification that follows justifies a man who believes.
The scope has to be personal for both the guilt and the grace.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? This view of human nature, it strips away any reliance on personal merit, or your cultural heritage, or any collective identity. It makes the gospel a message of free grace directed at the particular person who believes. It assures you that your guilt is personal, and because of that, your forgiveness must also be personal.
And a final thought for you to consider. Since this universal depravity is defined not just by the absence of spiritual good, but also by an infallible disposition to be wicked as soon as possible, this native state is present from the very earliest stages of our existence. What does this deep-seated congenital reality tell us about the immediate need for God's grace and intervention in the life of every person, even from the moment they draw breath? It makes the free offer of Christ's imputed righteousness the most urgent and the most precious offer imaginable.